In the pristine halls of the Galactic Research Council, alien scientists had believed that every mystery of the cosmos was already at their fingertips. Their calculations were flawless, their methods precise. Every species under their watch followed the rules, adhered to the order. Until, that is, they met humans. From the moment Sarah, a human engineer, stepped into the Research Council's top lab, holding nothing but a coffee mug and a handful of tools, things started to bend. Gravity shifted. Alien equipment began acting unpredictably, and, most unsettlingly, the unshakable alien protocol faced its first real test. What could this primitive life form possibly know that they didn't? How could she be so calm in the face of their most complex crisis? As the situation spiraled, one thing became increasingly clear. Humans seemed to thrive on chaos. For every well-defined rule the aliens clung to, humans had an exception, a workaround, a defiance. And yet each improvised solution Sarah offered brought a breakthrough that eluded the Council's brightest. Could it be that the secrets of the universe weren't in their technology or formulas, but in the human ability to dive headfirst into the unknown? But could the Council accept that? After all, no one likes to be told they're doing it wrong, especially by someone who breaks every rule in the book. The Galactic Research Council was a place of order, precision, and undeniable hierarchy. It sprawled across a planet so advanced that even its air was calculated for optimal productivity. Alien scientists, bureaucrats, and engineers moved with synchronized purpose, each dressed in robes that shimmered under the artificial daylight. Every detail, from their structured movements to the protocols followed, reflected a society that believed it had mastered the universe. Rumors swirled about humans, but no one took them seriously. Species across galaxies had their quirks, but humans? They were labeled death worlders in academic reports, but many in the Council chalked that up to sensationalism. The beings of Earth were primitives who somehow thrived on an unstable, chaotic world that would have spelled doom for most civilizations. It was more folklore than fact. How could a creature survive on sheer stubbornness? They chuckled. But deep down, an unspoken anxiety lingered in council halls. Earth's reputation as a death world had earned it a peculiar place in galactic consciousness, a source of fascination and quiet dread. Tales circulated about humans who seemed immune to radiation, who survived freezing temperatures with only fabric for protection, who crossed vast deserts with nothing but a container of water. It was amusing in a way, but also deeply unsettling to a society that prized predictability and caution above all else. Then came the crisis. A malfunction had struck their core research lab, a failure in their energy grid that defied every logical solution. Calculations were checked, rechecked, and still, the power fluctuations threatened to destabilize the entire facility. No one could explain why the protocols that had worked flawlessly for centuries were now crumbling under this anomaly. The council leaders stood in tense conference rooms, brows furrowed, voices hushed. For the first time, the suggestion was made: bring in a human. The counselors exchanged uneasy glances. Wouldn't that be a step back? But their technological prowess and high-minded logic had failed to solve the problem. After all their pride, they had to admit they were stumped. Begrudgingly, a message was sent. Request assistance, it read, though every alien in the room bristled at the thought of calling upon such a primitive species for help. A single human arrived, Sarah, an engineer from Earth. She was clad in an unassuming suit, eyes alert and unimpressed by the gleaming alien technology that surrounded her. The council observed from a distance, as though afraid she might somehow compromise their advanced systems by her mere presence. As Sarah inspected the failing energy systems, the council members couldn't help but exchange whispers. She seemed unfazed, sipping from her mug and occasionally scratching her head. When she reached into her toolkit and pulled out, of all things, a roll of duct tape, several aliens winced, visibly recoiling at what they considered an insult to their sophisticated systems. The tension was palpable. Counselors muttered among themselves, barely containing their disdain. What is that adhesive meant to do? Patch a starship? One scoffed. Others shook their heads, barely concealing their horror. But Sarah's calmness held an unsettling confidence. Her actions defied their norms, yet she worked with such ease, almost as if the failing systems around her were nothing more than minor inconveniences. "What's the plan?" one alien finally asked, barely able to keep the sarcasm from his tone. She glanced up, shrugged, and simply replied, "Let's get this thing running." The council's shock was tangible. Was this how humans tackled the unknown? Without reverence, without caution? For them, every step was meticulously planned, every movement optimized. The idea that someone could simply wing it was both baffling and horrifying. Their whispered doubts grew louder. Is she even qualified? This can't work. But as Sarah continued her work, her methods, strange, unrefined, and painfully direct, began to yield results. Watching her, one counselor couldn't resist voicing the collective unease. "How is this functional?" he muttered, voice filled with contempt. Sarah simply laughed, looking up with a grin that seemed almost mischievous. "Where I come from, we don't wait around for the perfect solution. We find something that works and keep moving." The council was speechless, wrestling with both admiration and resentment. Could it be that in all their pursuit of perfection, they'd overlooked something vital? They'd prided themselves on efficiency and control, and yet here was this human, succeeding by ignoring all of their rules. Their respect for her methods was grudging, laced with indignation and reluctant fascination. As she moved deeper into the malfunctioning core, the aliens observed her every movement, making a silent vow to never again dismiss the species from Earth as mere death-worlders. But they couldn't help but ask themselves, is this human ingenuity or simply recklessness in disguise? It wasn't the elegant solution they'd envisioned, but it worked. With each repaired section, their confidence in their superiority wavered. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to humanity than they'd ever thought possible. The energy systems hummed back to life, albeit not quite as smoothly as before. The council, monitoring from their control room, could hardly believe their eyes. This human, armed with nothing but basic tools and sheer determination, had managed to stabilize what their most advanced systems couldn't. The council's pride took a palpable hit, yet the underlying astonishment was undeniable. They'd never seen a creature so indifferent to the norms they held dear. As Sarah finished her repairs, the tension in the room grew thicker. She took a deep breath and stretched casually, as though patching up an interstellar core with duct tape was just another day at work. Counselor Silan, one of the more senior members, could no longer contain his disapproval. "You humans," he began, his voice dripping with restrained disdain, "do you truly believe this kind of patchwork is an acceptable solution?" Sarah glanced at him, her face a mixture of amusement and genuine curiosity. "It's not about perfection," she replied with a shrug. "It's about survival. Besides, what matters more, the fix itself or the fact that the problem's solved?" The alien counselors exchanged uneasy glances. This way of thinking was alien to them. Why rush into a solution without meticulously planned contingencies? Why not take the time to weigh every angle, examine every potential risk? It was almost reckless, and yet somehow it worked. Counselor Urique, a researcher infamous for his skepticism of all things Earth-related, leaned forward, unable to resist his urge to challenge her. "Humans thrive on chaos," he stated, more to his fellow aliens than to Sarah herself. "You ignore the rules and rely on luck." Sarah just laughed. "We call it creativity," she replied, smiling warmly. "Besides, luck's just another name for being prepared to make a move when things go sideways." The counselors were silent, each wrestling with the uneasy realization that perhaps they had underestimated Earth's death-worlders. But Counselor Silan wasn't ready to let go of his reservations. "Luck and creativity are no substitute for careful planning. We must account for every variable." With a small shake of her head, Sarah stepped back, surveying the patched-up reactor. "Where I come from," she said, her voice taking on a more serious tone, "we don't always have the luxury of planning for every single variable. Sometimes, we just do what we can with what we've got." The room fell into a charged silence. For the council, Sarah's words bordered on sacrilege. How could anyone live without absolute control over their environment? How could anyone be willing to accept a solution that wasn't, by every measurable standard, perfect? And yet, as they watched the hum of the reactor stabilizing under Sarah's haphazard repairs, there was no denying the effectiveness of her approach. The counselors felt a shift, an uneasy acceptance settling in. Maybe, just maybe, there was something they could learn from these creatures they'd so long dismissed as lesser beings. It was then that Sarah offered an invitation, breaking the solemnity. "Feel free to subscribe to our earthly methods," she quipped, with a wink that left the counselors bewildered. She wasn't just confident, she was enjoying this. "And while you're at it, drop a comment below if you think you could have handled it any better." Her words took a moment to settle, the counselors left blinking at her apparent ease in the face of such tension. While they had always taken their work with utmost seriousness, Sarah approached this high-stakes situation with a startling calm, as though disaster was something humans dealt with daily. And that was when Counselor Jix, the quiet, ever-observant one, finally broke his silence. "Tell me," he said, his voice barely a murmur. "Is this truly how humans survive, by adapting to disaster so readily?" Sarah met his gaze, her eyes full of a wisdom born from living on a chaotic planet that many would never dare visit. "We don't just survive, Counselor," she answered quietly. "We learn. Every setback, every broken system, every moment we have to think on our feet, it all makes us stronger. It's just how we're built." In that instant, something in the room shifted. The counselors exchanged glances, feeling a new sense of respect, not just for Sarah, but for all of humanity. Here was a species that thrived in uncertainty, that made a habit out of defying the odds. It was both baffling and, they had to admit, inspiring. As Sarah prepared to leave, Counselor Silan managed a begrudging nod. "Perhaps. There is more to your kind than we initially believed." Sarah grinned, raising her coffee mug in a mock salute. "And maybe you'll figure that out if you hit like on this new perspective," she joked, before adding with a wink, "We humans always appreciate a thumbs up." For a moment, the counselors merely stared at her, unsure whether to take her words as a jest or a challenge. And then, as if on cue, the realization dawned on them. Humans were indeed strange creatures, utterly incomprehensible, undeniably unconventional. But maybe, just maybe, they were exactly what the universe needed. With the energy system barely stabilized, the Galactic Research Council members reluctantly conceded that Sarah's primitive methods had worked. But as they breathed a sigh of collective relief, another warning flashed across the control screens. A low, ominous hum echoed through the facility. The reactor system had only been the beginning. In their haste to address the core failure, they had overlooked a growing instability in other areas of the facility. The first sign was a tremor that reverberated through the floors. At once, Counselor Shilan's face paled. "Impossible," he whispered, eyes locked on the display that now flashed a warning for structural breaches in critical sections of the lab. A reactor breach was one thing, but if the structural systems failed, they were looking at a cascade of damage that could destroy the entire facility. Sarah, meanwhile, watched the counselors scramble, her expression calm, assessing. To her, this was familiar territory. When one problem sparked another, you simply addressed each one as it came. In her mind, it was all part of the same to-do list. But the council, for all their advanced technology, was paralyzed. The idea of dealing with overlapping issues all at once was unthinkable. For them, a failure like this should have been impossible. Their systems were meant to withstand every scenario. Counselor Urique's voice broke through the growing panic. This is unacceptable. A failure in the secondary containment layer should not happen." Sarah shrugged, grabbing her toolkit again. "Well, here we are. Looks like you all could use another helping hand. Or duct tape." Several counselors cringed at the mention of duct tape, but with each passing second, the tremors grew stronger. Equipment rattled on shelves, monitors flickered. Sarah moved quickly, patching one panel after another, stabilizing pressure systems and sealing breaches as best she could. For every minor repair she made, the system seemed to stabilize, if only temporarily. "Your methods are dangerously unrefined," Shilan snapped, watching as Sarah used her tools to jury-rig solutions that barely made sense to him. She just grinned, as if amused by his panic. "Good enough for me," she replied. "If it holds, it holds." She leaned in, giving him a quick wink. "Feel free to hit that like button if you're enjoying the show." The counselors exchanged a bewildered glance, stunned by her nonchalance. How could someone be so calm in the face of such overwhelming disaster? To them, the cascading failures were catastrophic. To her, they were simply the next item to tackle. Suddenly, a critical alert sounded from the facility's main control hub. An energy spike in the lower levels, caused by the initial reactor malfunction, had sent waves of radiation seeping into other sectors. The council members recoiled in horror. Radiation was lethal, requiring meticulous cleanup and exacting procedures. Sarah, however, didn't even blink. "Well, looks like I'll need to fix that too," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. But Counselor Jix grabbed her arm, panic etched across his face. You can't go down there. The levels of radiation, it's suicide." She shook him off, her expression steady. "Oh, please, I've walked through worse." Without further argument, she grabbed her toolkit and headed for the lower levels, leaving the council frozen in place. Her journey through the radiation zone was surreal. The walls glowed faintly, and the air felt heavy, charged with static. But as she moved, she couldn't help but feel a strange thrill, a challenge to overcome. And she knew, somewhere deep down, that the council members were watching her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She could almost hear their thoughts. How does she survive this? How does any human? Upon reaching the central panel, she surveyed the damage. Radiation had fried several critical circuits, and the systems were on the brink of collapse. As she worked, she spoke into her communicator, the council listening closely from the control room. "All right, listen up," she said, her voice casual. "This is going to sound unorthodox, but I need you all to override your system protocols." A horrified gasp echoed over the line. Override protocol? That was the equivalent of disregarding centuries of accumulated safety measures. Counselor Silan's voice was incredulous. "Override protocol? Are you insane?" She chuckled softly. "No, just practical. We either bypass the fried circuits or this place is toast. Trust me, or don't. Either way, it's happening." She was met with silence, but she continued her work, feeling the council's reluctant compliance as they disabled one system after another. Minutes felt like hours as she moved from one panel to the next, each fix feeling more temporary than the last. But each repair bought them a few more moments, giving her time to stabilize the next critical component. To the council, her approach seemed erratic, almost reckless. But her focus, her confidence, it was unmistakably effective. Meanwhile, Counselor Eureka, watching from the control room, couldn't help but mutter to his colleagues, "These humans, they don't see rules as we do. They treat chaos like a tool." Counselor Jix nodded slowly, awe creeping into his voice. And somehow, it works. The council's astonishment only grew as Sarah moved through the system, patching holes and rerouting energy with unflinching calm. They had never seen a creature treat disaster with such casual defiance, as if catastrophe was something to shrug off. Suddenly, her voice crackled over the line again. "Just another day at the office, folks. Don't forget to comment if you think you could have done it faster." There was a stunned silence. The council didn't know what to say. Was this human mocking them, or was she truly this fearless? Her confidence bordered on arrogance, yet every move she made brought the facility closer to stabilization. For the first time, the council members found themselves questioning their entire approach. Could it be that their rigid systems and protocols, their obsession with control, had blinded them to the power of adaptability? Just as the counselors were beginning to relax, a new alarm sounded. The energy grid was restored, but it had triggered an ancient, dormant failsafe. The council members stared in horror as screens lit up with warnings. A self-destruct sequence had been activated, set to eradicate the facility in a bid to contain the radiation. Sarah sighed as she read the data from her communicator. "Well, that's inconvenient," she muttered, rubbing the back of her neck. "Looks like we're really on a countdown now." The counselors panicked, scrambling to find a way to override the self-destruct. Counselor Zilan's voice trembled as he shouted into the communicator, Shut it down, you have to shut it down. Sarah shook her head, maintaining her unnerving calm. You can't always shut things down when they go haywire. Sometimes you just keep moving and deal with the fallout. The counselors were silent, a newfound respect creeping into their expressions as they watched her tackle the final repairs. Despite the looming danger, she approached the task with an almost playful defiance, as though daring the universe to throw one more obstacle in her way. Finally, with seconds to spare, she reconfigured the last system. The alarm ceased, and the self-destruct was disabled. The council members slumped in relief, the weight of disaster averted resting heavy on them. Sarah, however, simply took a long, satisfied breath and glanced back toward the council members, who were still gaping at her in astonishment. "Not bad for a primitive, right?" she teased, her eyes twinkling. "If you enjoyed the crisis, don't forget to subscribe for more." In the silence that followed, the council members felt the full impact of what they had witnessed. This human, this so-called Death Worlder, had just defied every protocol they held sacred. She had faced the impossible with nothing but makeshift solutions, and somehow, against all odds, she had prevailed. And for the first time, the council understood what it truly meant to be human, to embrace chaos, to act without certainty, to fix what could not be fixed, simply because failure was not an option. They had once considered humans inferior, but now they saw them in a new light, resilient, resourceful, and perhaps even admirable. The Galactic Research Council members watched as Sarah wrapped up the final repairs, their disbelief hanging in the air like a thick fog. For the first time, they were truly silent, not the respectful silence of a room waiting to proceed, but the stunned quiet of minds grappling with a reality that defied everything they'd known. Counselor Jix, the quiet observer, finally broke the silence. "This shouldn't be possible," he murmured, as though speaking the words might somehow negate the truth in front of him. "Everything we know, everything we believe, none of it could prepare us for this." Counselor Ceylon, still processing the near catastrophe, shifted uncomfortably. "Human methods lack precision. They defy protocol, and yet—" He trailed off, unable to articulate the growing sense of admiration and perhaps a tinge of fear building within him. Sarah noticed their discomfort, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "You all look like you've seen a ghost," she quipped, pulling out a chair and sinking into it with an ease that felt almost jarring in the high-stakes setting. "What's the matter? Haven't you ever met someone who takes things one crisis at a time?" Counselor Ulrich turned to her, his expression conflicted. "In our society," he began, his voice unsteady, "we are taught that order is the foundation of progress. Chaos, it leads only to ruin. Your actions, your methods, they're reckless." Sarah simply nodded, her eyes steady. "Where I come from, we see it differently. Chaos isn't something to be feared. It's just life. You learn to work with it." Her words seemed to strike a chord. For as long as they could remember, the council members had lived in a world of meticulously crafted order. Every system, every protocol, was designed to prevent the very thing they'd witnessed today. And yet, as Sarah had shown them, their structured approach had failed when it was needed most. They'd spent their lives controlling every variable, but control had its limits. Counselor Jix swallowed, feeling the weight of a question he had never dared to consider before. What does it feel like?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "To live without certainty?" Sarah tilted her head, considering his question thoughtfully. "It feels like freedom, and sometimes like madness. But mostly it feels like strength." She paused, her gaze drifting as though seeing some distant memory. "You find out who you really are when things fall apart." The council members exchanged uneasy glances. They had always been told that strength lay in discipline, in predictability. But as they looked at Sarah, they began to see a different kind of strength, one born not from control, but from resilience, from the ability to adapt, to improvise, to face the unknown without flinching. Counselor Ceylon clenched his fists, his pride warring with the admiration he could no longer deny. "Are humans all like this?" he asked, his voice tinged with a hint of reverence he couldn't hide. Sarah chuckled softly. "Not all of us, but enough to make things interesting." She leaned forward, a spark of mischief in her eyes. "And if you're really lucky, you might just learn a thing or two from us." The council's discomfort deepened, each of them grappling with an existential crisis that went beyond the mere practicalities of survival. They had spent their lives believing that they stood at the pinnacle of evolution, that their civilization's order and precision were the truest measures of advancement. But now, faced with the unorthodox resilience of a human, they found themselves questioning everything. "How can you be so certain?" Counselor Ulrich asked, the desperation clear in his voice. "If everything is chaos, if nothing is stable, how do you keep moving forward?" Sarah shrugged. "Certainty is an illusion. The truth is, we're never certain. We just make the best decisions we can with what we have. And when things go wrong, we adapt. That's what makes us, well, us." Her words hit them like a shockwave. To live without certainty, to embrace chaos as a way of life, it was unthinkable and yet undeniably powerful. They had always viewed adaptability as a weakness, a lack of control. But Sarah's presence, her confidence in the face of disaster, showed them that adaptability was, in fact, a strength they had underestimated. Counselor Jix, staring at Sarah as though seeing her for the first time, murmured, "Perhaps we have much to learn." As Sarah began to pack up her tools, Counselor Gilland spoke up, his voice filled with a vulnerability he would have once considered shameful. "You humans, you survive the impossible. You defy every rule we hold dear, and yet—" He hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "There's something terrifying about your resilience, something boundless." Sarah grinned, an edge of challenge in her gaze. "Terrifying, maybe, but also kind of impressive, wouldn't you say?" The counselors remained silent, each grappling with their own reflections. For the first time, they were beginning to understand what it meant to be human, and for the first time, they felt a glimmer of something they had never felt toward another species: awe. As Sarah walked toward the exit, Counselor Ulrich called out to her, his voice raw with the weight of realization. "Tell me, if we were to embrace this chaos, this uncertainty, what would happen?" Sarah paused, looking over her shoulder with a knowing smile. "Who knows? Maybe you'd change the universe. Or maybe," she added with a wink, "you'd just get a whole lot better at fixing things when they go wrong." And with that, she was gone, leaving the council members in a stunned, contemplative silence. In the quiet that followed, each counselor felt the stirrings of a shift within themselves. Their beliefs, once so unshakable, now felt fragile, like a structure on the verge of collapse. They had always seen themselves as masters of the universe, bound by rules and order. But now, thanks to one human, they glimpsed a new path, a path fraught with uncertainty but filled with possibility. As the council members returned to their posts, they carried with them a strange, unsettling realization. The universe was far larger, far more chaotic than they had ever imagined. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was the very thing that made it worth exploring. Just as the council members began to grasp the revelations Sarah had left in her wake, a new alert blared across the facility's communication system. Screens across the control room lit up in red, displaying warnings that sent the council members into a state of sheer panic. Critical systems that had been stabilized only minutes before were now in imminent danger of failing again. Only this time the issues were compounded by unpredictable surges in the core reactors. It seemed that the underlying instability was spreading, sending shockwaves through every part of the facility. Counselor Gilland, hands shaking, barely managed to get out a coherent sentence. We just fixed this. How is it possible that the systems are destabilizing so rapidly?" Counselor Ulrich, his voice a blend of frustration and desperation, muttered, "This should be impossible. There are layers upon layers of redundancy built into these systems. This facility was designed to withstand anything." But the screens told a different story. The pristine technology they so deeply revered was buckling under the relentless demands of this crisis. They had tried every protocol, every fail-safe. Nothing was enough. In the midst of the chaos, a familiar voice crackled over the intercom. "Need some help down there?" Sarah's tone was unmistakably casual, almost too calm for the situation. She'd noticed the facility-wide alarm and returned just in time. Counselor Shilan hesitated, his pride clashing with his desperate need for assistance. Finally, he swallowed his pride and responded, We could use your expertise, human." Sarah's laugh was light, almost teasing. "All right then, let's see what else I can do to keep this place from falling apart." She entered the control room, her gaze sweeping over the screens that displayed critical failures in a dozen different systems. The situation was worse than she'd expected, but her confidence remained unshaken. "First things first," she announced. "We're going to have to reconfigure the energy flow to stop the surges from reaching critical mass. And yes, it's going to require bypassing some of those precious protocols of yours." Counselor Ulrich opened his mouth to protest, but a quick glance at the flashing screen silenced him. At this point, they were beyond protocols. They were fighting for survival. Sarah quickly moved to the primary control panel, her fingers flying over the unfamiliar alien controls with an ease that seemed almost impossible. Her first action was a direct override of the containment systems, rerouting energy to bypass damaged circuits. The counselors watched in stunned silence as she worked, adapting to their technology with an uncanny intuition. Suddenly, the facility shuddered, a deep, resonant hum reverberating through its walls. Sarah narrowed her eyes, analyzing the source. "Looks like the reactor core is still struggling to stabilize. We're going to have to relieve some of that pressure, or we'll be dealing with an explosion big enough to vaporize half this sector." Counselor Ceylon, pale with fear, stammered, That would be catastrophic. The entire research colony would be lost." "Then it's a good thing I'm here, huh?" she replied, her tone as steady as ever. She punched a few more commands into the panel and then looked over her shoulder. "I'm going to need you all to activate the secondary coolant systems on my mark, and no hesitation. We only have one shot at this." The counselors exchanged nervous glances, their hands hovering over the controls. They weren't used to this kind of high-stakes improvisation, this reckless disregard for established protocols. But in that moment, they realized they had no choice. Sarah's confidence had become their only lifeline. "On 3, she instructed, her voice leaving no room for doubt. 1, 2, 3. With a collective intake of breath, the counselors activated the secondary coolant systems. The screens flashed as coolant levels surged through the reactor's conduits, dropping the internal temperature just enough to prevent a catastrophic meltdown. The relief in the room was palpable, but Sarah wasn't done yet. "All right," she said, not missing a beat. "That'll buy us some time, but we're not out of the woods yet. We're going to need a more permanent solution, and fast." A sudden alarm blared, signaling a critical failure in the facility's communication array. Without that system, they'd lose control over vital commands, rendering any further stabilization efforts impossible. The counselors gaped at the screen in horror. One failure after another. Could this chaos have no end? Sarah clenched her fists, her mind racing. "The communication array's down. That's not ideal. But if I can reach the core array physically, I might be able to reroute the systems manually." Counselor Ulrich looked at her, wide-eyed. "You can't possibly mean the core array is located in the high radiation zone." She shrugged, flashing a defiant grin. "We've established I don't mind a little radiation. Now, are you going to guide me to the access point, or do I have to figure it out myself?" Ulrich swallowed hard, fighting the impulse to object. For the first time, he understood why humans were called Deathworlders, not because they sought danger, but because they simply didn't let it stop them. He nodded, pointing to a hallway that led toward the core. "The access point is through there. But be careful." "Always am," she replied, giving a quick salute before dashing down the corridor. The council members watched her go, a mixture of fear and admiration etched on their faces. Sarah reached the core array access, her surroundings humming with the ominous energy of a facility on the brink. She moved quickly, her hands steady as she opened the panel and got to work. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she bypassed circuits and rerouted systems, racing against time to stabilize the critical functions. Back in the control room, the council members held their breath, watching the monitors as Sarah's handiwork slowly began to restore functionality to the failing systems. But just as the tension seemed to ease, a final alert sounded. A shock wave from the reactor threatened to overload the central command hub. Counselor Zilan's voice trembled. This is it. There's no way to survive a core breach at this scale." But Sarah's voice crackled over the comms, defiant as ever. "Not yet, it isn't. I'm going to divert the core energy through the emergency conduits. It won't be pretty, and it might just tear a hole in the hull, but it'll stop the explosion." Counselor Jix, looking at the control screen, whispered, "A hole in the hull? But we'd be exposed to the vacuum of space." "Better than getting vaporized, don't you think?" Sarah countered, her tone sharp, pushing them beyond their comfort zones. With no other option, the counselors braced themselves, acknowledging her plan. For the first time in their lives, they trusted in something other than their protocols. They trusted in a human's resilience. In a mad rush, Sarah reconfigured the emergency conduits, forcing the core's energy into channels not designed to hold it. The facility shuddered violently as the redirected energy surged through the conduits. The walls groaned, metal creaked, and alarms blared. But as the energy bled out into space, the core's temperature began to stabilize, the imminent threat finally averted. Back in the control room, the council members exhaled, their faces pale, hearts racing. The facility had survived. Against every law of probability, every carefully crafted protocol, they had survived. As Sarah limped back to the control room, dusted with grime and exhaustion, the counselors could only stare in awe. Counselor Zilan managed a shaky breath. You saved us." She offered a tired smile, her eyes twinkling with defiance. "Just another day for a death worlder. But hey, if you're impressed, you know where the subscribe button is." For the first time in their lives, the counselors laughed, a strange, bewildered sound that filled the control room. They had fought side by side with a human, faced chaos with her, and now, as they looked at her with a newfound respect, they realized something they'd never imagined. Humans, these chaotic, resilient creatures, might just be the allies they'd always needed. In the aftermath of the crisis, the Galactic Research Council's facility lay in a stunned silence. Alarms had finally ceased, systems were stabilizing, and the ominous hum of impending disaster had faded. For the first time in what felt like hours, the counselors could breathe, though their relief was tempered by the lingering disbelief that they had survived at all. Sarah, weary but unbroken, slumped into a chair in the control room, her gaze drifting over the counselors who now looked at her with something akin to awe. Gone were their expressions of disdain and skepticism. In their place was an unmistakable respect. She had accomplished what they'd believed was impossible, defied protocols they'd thought unbreakable, and walked through radiation zones without so much as a second thought. To the counselors, she was as much an enigma as she was a hero. Counselor Zilan, his voice subdued, broke the silence. "You saved our facility, and perhaps even us." He looked away, the admission clearly weighing on him. "We never would have managed it on our own." Sarah smiled, but there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. "Sometimes you just have to dive in, Zilan. There's no time to second guess, to question if every move is perfect. You just do what needs to be done." Her words lingered, a quiet challenge that resonated with each of them. For so long they had clung to their ways, convinced that their systems and protocols were the only paths to progress. But now, in the wake of everything that had happened, they were left questioning if they'd been limiting themselves all along. Counselor Ulrich, his voice hesitant, looked at her with an uncharacteristic vulnerability. "We always thought humans were reckless, that you took unnecessary risks, operated without caution. But now—" He paused, searching for the right words. "Now I wonder if perhaps you've simply learned to survive in ways we never dared." Sarah chuckled softly, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Surviving isn't about following rules. It's about adapting, learning, moving forward, even when things don't make sense." She paused, her gaze steady. "And maybe, just maybe, it's about finding strength in the chaos." A murmur spread among the counselors, a ripple of understanding they had never felt before. They were realizing, slowly but surely, that perhaps their way wasn't the only way, and for the first time, they felt a strange sense of curiosity, a desire to explore the unknown, to embrace the possibilities that lay beyond their strict boundaries. Counselor Jix stepped forward, his eyes reflecting a new resolve. "Sarah," he began, his voice laced with a newfound admiration, "if we were to learn this way of yours, to embrace the unknown, would you guide us?" The room fell silent. It was a vulnerable question, one that would have been unthinkable hours before, and yet here they were, asking a human for guidance in a field they had always believed they'd mastered. Sarah smiled, but there was no hint of superiority in her expression, only warmth and acceptance. "I'd be honored," she replied, her voice soft but strong. "But understand this, it won't be easy. Embracing chaos means letting go of certainty, of control. You'll need to trust each other, and trust yourselves, even when everything around you feels like it's falling apart." The counselors nodded, absorbing her words with a quiet determination. They had seen firsthand the strength in adaptability, the resilience in facing the unknown. And they realized, perhaps for the first time, that they wanted to be part of something greater than mere order. They wanted to grow, to challenge themselves, to discover what lay beyond the boundaries they'd created. As Sarah gathered her things, Counselor Ceylon took a step forward, his voice softer than it had ever been. "Before you go, I must apologize for doubting you, for doubting your kind." Sarah met his gaze, her eyes filled with understanding. "No need for apologies, Ceylon. We all have our ways of surviving, but maybe now we can learn from each other." She gave him a small nod, her expression sincere. "And hey, if you're ever in need of a little chaos, you know where to find me." Her words were met with a quiet chuckle from the counselors, an unspoken acknowledgement of how far they'd come in the span of a single crisis. They had started this day viewing her as little more than a curiosity, a primitive anomaly. Now she was an ally, someone who had taught them more than they'd ever thought possible. As she turned to leave, Counselor Jix called after her, his voice hesitant. "Sarah, before you go, could we perhaps visit Earth one day?" She glanced back, a mischievous twinkle in her eye. "You're welcome any time. Just be prepared for a world where nothing goes according to plan, and where chaos is the only thing you can count on." With that, she was gone, leaving the council in a contemplative silence. They had begun this day bound by protocols, confined by their need for control. But now, as they stood together in the aftermath of the crisis, they felt a sense of unity that transcended order. They had glimpsed a new way forward, one filled with uncertainty but also with promise. And as they looked around the control room, still buzzing with the faint echoes of Sarah's presence, each of them felt a quiet hope, a sense that perhaps, with a little bit of chaos, they too could become something more. Months had passed since the day the Galactic Research Council faced its greatest crisis. Yet the events of that day lingered, etched into the memories of every counselor who had been there. The facility was fully repaired, restored to its former precision and order. But to those who had witnessed the chaos and survived it, things felt different. Protocols were still followed, systems meticulously maintained, but now a subtle shift had taken root among the counselors. Counselor Jix, known once as the most steadfast adherent of protocol, found himself pondering the value of flexibility, of embracing the unpredictable. On more than one occasion, he had quietly bypassed a minor protocol in favor of efficiency, a thought that would have horrified him only months earlier. Counselor Ceylon, meanwhile, had developed a strange habit, studying Earth cultures in his free time, poring over stories of human ingenuity and resilience. The reports on Death Worlders, once met with skepticism and thinly veiled disdain, now became sources of fascination. He found himself wondering, not with fear, but with curiosity, just what it would be like to experience Earth's infamous unpredictability firsthand. One quiet evening, as the council members gathered for their monthly review, a message arrived on their central communication array. The counselors exchanged curious glances before displaying the transmission on the central screen. The message was from Sarah. "Greetings from Earth. Just checking in to make sure you haven't forgotten the importance of a little chaos in your lives. Thought I'd send an invitation in case any of you want to experience it firsthand. Earth awaits." The council members stared at the message, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. Counselor Ulrich spoke up first, his voice barely a whisper. Do you think we're ready? Counselor Jix nodded, a faint smile gracing his face. I think we'll never be ready. But perhaps that's exactly why we should go. A murmur of agreement passed through the room. It was true. No amount of preparation could truly prepare them for the unpredictability of Earth. But maybe that was the point. Maybe, in embracing the unknown, they would find a strength they had overlooked, a resilience they had yet to cultivate. As the counselors quietly approved the mission to Earth, each of them felt a quiet thrill, a sense that they were standing on the brink of something new. And in that moment, they understood what it meant to be human, to face the unknown with courage, to embrace chaos with open hearts. And somewhere, light years away, Sarah raised her coffee mug to the stars, a small smile on her face as she awaited the arrival of her unexpected allies.